Shalom, everybody. Thank you for joining me again. Parshat Tzav, the next Parsha. And Tzav takes us into a particular situation in preparation for the functioning of the Mishkan. At first, it comes across as an extremely technical situation, ritualistic. It has to do with sacrifices. It has to do, by and large, with the inauguration of the priests, the inauguration of the priests into their priesthood, the various sacrifices that are necessary, and the clothes, of course, that will create them into their roles. And all that is commanded to Moshe by God, and Moshe is to convey these commands to the priests, the new priests. The inauguration period is 7 days. And as I said, it's very technical. It's very technical till the last section, which I want to focus on. But before we get there, I'd like to make a rather sideway comment. And that is to point out how very different from that dry technical account of those 7 days is the account that you get in the midrash. One dimension of this in the midrash is to point up the hidden tensions that exist between Moshe and Aaron. Who would have thought? We would have thought that Moshe is simply the intermediary who passes on the commandments, the instructions, and Aaron and his fellow priests enact them and become priests thereby. It turns out that according to classic midrashic traditions, Moshe is to act as high priest during those 7 days. He is to wear the clothes of the high priest, and he is to train the priests to do what he is doing, right? Kind of mimesis, that they will imitate him. And then at the end of the time, he will, of course, take off his robes and put them onto Aaron. That's the technical level of what's going on during those 7 days. But the midrash goes further, and the midrash suggests that there are real hidden tensions between Moshe and Aaron, Oedipal tensions, you might almost say. That Moshe has feelings about being high priest and about stopping being high priest at the end of the 7 days. That is, there's something in him that wants to be high priest. And there's something difficult for him about having to strip himself, right? He invests Aaron, that's exactly the word in English, in the Latin English, is to dress Aaron up, put him in vestments. He dresses Aaron in the clothes that he was really quite accustomed to wearing himself during those 7 days, and rather liked it. So it was going to be a shock for him, a disappointment. There was going to be a human crisis in this investiture and divestment of robes. We remember that back at the burning bush, God calls out to Moshe, and Moshe says, Hineni, here I am. Midrash says, here I am, ready for the high priesthood, ready for being king. And suddenly we have a strange flash on Moshe, midrashic flash on Moshe, as having ambitions, as having a sort of dream, a fantasy that he will be everything. There is something in him that is open to that. Of course, it's complicated, because when God does give him a mission back there at the burning bush, Moshe absolutely refuses. And what God said to him, L'cha ve'ishlachacha el Paro, come, I'm going to send you as my messenger to Paro. Moshe answered equally definitely, Shlach na biyad tishlach. Send whatever messenger you want, so long as it's not me. So he absolutely refuses the role that's offered. And yet it seems he has quite an appetite in some way for positions of power. And so you have a sense of a complexity there. If you were really to know Moshe, which is impossible, of course, no one ever knew Moshe because he is too complex, then you would realize that it takes the midrash to start trying to tease out some of the threads that belong to the inner life of Moshe. So that Moshe it'll be an effort for him in the end to take off those clothes. and to put them on to Aaron. And there's a kind of description of a generous, loving relationship between the brothers, where Aaron feels bad for Moshe that he has to give up these robes after all the work he's done for the Mishkan. And Moshe responds to Aaron, but I remember how pleased you were, right? Sameach belibo, when I was appointed as the leader of the people, and you in some way had to accept demotion. You had been the leader of the tribe at that time, and you were unequivocally happy for me. And now I return it. So there's a sense of a kind of ennobling process that comes out of really living through a situation of tension, acknowledging the tension and taking responsibility for it so that Moshe can turn the energy of his desire onto Aaron. He sublimates it. Aaron will now be, his pleasure in Aaron's destiny will take up all the energy of his own desire. So there's a sense here again of not just a hidden tension, but hidden ethical work. That is, interesting things have gone on inside Moshe during these 7 days. It's not quite as dry and external as it looks. This passage of investiture, of inauguration, ends at the end of the Parsha, and I want to read the last few verses. It's chapter 8, verse 33 onwards. The unexpected coda, the maftir. Umipetach oel moed lo tetz'u shivat yamim. And you priests, when you've finished as you work through all these sacrifices day by day, you train yourselves in doing them. At night you shall never leave the entrance to the tent of assembly for 7 days. In other words, you're under house arrest now. That is an unexpected detail, that these preparations have to do not just with technical instructions, but they have to do with a kind of strange restraint. Restraint is put upon them. They can't go out into the world during that time. And these 7 days are called the Yemei HaMiluim, the days of your filling, when you come to fill a role, you come to fill new costumes. So these 7 days, you don't go out until the day when the days of your filling are filled. Ad melot Yemei Miluechem. Several times the word is used. Ki shivat yamim yimalei et yadchem. For 7 days, God will fill your hands. The idea of filling of the hands, miluim. Apparently there was a tradition that someone who was appointed to a new position of power at a certain point in the Middle Ages, I think it was, they would actually come and deliver to him a leather glove and put it in his hand, as if by way of saying, this is the magic of investiture. This is the magic of putting on the right clothes and suddenly becoming someone else. You're going to need 7 days, not just to learn all the details and all the detailed laws, but you're going to need 7 days to do something else, which should never be interrupted. Ka'asher asa bayom hazeh, as you have done on this day, so God commanded to do, to atone for you. It's all a process of atonement. And then again, ufetach ohel moed teshvu, you shall sit. Right? Now, for the first time, that word. You shall sit there at that entrance, the entrance of the tent of assembly, day and night for 7 days. It's a way of saying teshvu. It doesn't literally mean sit. It means you shall remain. You shall wait. You shall not go out. Lashevet is lo latzet. You will restrain yourselves from a natural instinct to perhaps to go home, to break the world of that 7 days. No, you maintain a world of waiting. Petach ohel moed teshvu yomim v'layla shivat yamim ushmartem et mishmeret Hashem. And you shall keep the charge of God. Lishmor. You shall, again, it's a word, lishmor means to conserve, to preserve, to observe. It means usually to keep a negative commandment, not to do anything forbidden. So you are there, as I said, under a kind of house arrest, not doing what you might have wanted to do, which is just to disintegrate, to go out into the world. You stay there concentrated, and the word lishmor always has these interesting overtones, which I'd like to try to describe now. On the one hand, it means to conserve something, to hold on to something from the past, not to let it go. On the other hand, it always has a future orientation. That is the idea that in some way you are looking towards a future, you're preparing inwardly for a future, you're waiting, you are vigilant, you're watching. Right? Leil Shimurim is the night of watching. That was the Seder night, when equivalently the people were forbidden to go out of the entrances of their houses during that night. Lo tetzu, you shall not, no one shall go out of there, and you shall, and that night is called the night of watching, in that old-fashioned sense, yes, of watching, which means keeping awake, aware, waiting for a future that is not yet here, and that I don't really know how to anticipate it. So it's anticipation of a future. Ushmartem et mishmeret Hashem. Ushmartem et hamatzot. Yes, the Seder night is followed by the description that you should keep watch over the matzot. It means to make sure they remain unleavened. But again, there is a sense of the preparation for a future, which one doesn't quite know yet in oneself. And there is perhaps what Eric Zantner, the literary critic, calls a crisis of investiture. When you try on new robes, when the bride gets dressed in her wedding dress, yes, on the day, she looks at herself in the mirror and she doesn't recognize herself. Is that really me? Apparently it is. Apparently that's the person I am supposed to be now, at least for this day. And it signifies something for the future. And that symbolism of something that's not me, now investing me, that I am now being clothed in it, always has a certain anxiety about it, which needs, it seems to me, in terms of this last passage, it needs not to be run away from. You know, I'm going home at night and I'll be myself again. But one needs to go deeper into it. One wears the clothes, one stays inside the Ohel Moed. Doing what? We don't know. Right? At night, presumably, you're sleeping. But there is that sense of trying to move into a place of the unknown. And this is a kind of liminal passage. It's a halfway, it's the borderline between the past and the future, and it's redolent with that sense of the future. Aviv shamar et hadavar. Right, I can't resist that most resonant memory from the past. You remember Yaakov is told the story of Yosef's dreams. The brothers are very jealous and full of hate. And Yaakov apparently poo-poos the dreams. What a strange dream, he says. It doesn't mean anything. The Aviv shamar et hadavar. But the Torah adds in a stage whisper, but his father kept the thing. He was vigilant. He took notice and he waited for the future. Mamtin umitzapeh la'asher yavo, Rashi says. Waiting in expectation for the future, that something is going to come of this dream. And that's a very inward experience of Yaakov. He's not going to say anything about it. He doesn't know anything particular about it. It's dvarim mimashmishim ubaim, in the wonderful expression of the midrash there, that there are things that are groping under the surface to become realized. And you can't see them yet, but they're like ghostly presences. They're radiations of the future. And somewhere one has that sense of awareness and of waiting. I wanted to quote Rosenzweig, Franz Rosenzweig, who has a wonderful passage that speaks to me a great deal. He says this: in Judaism, man is always somehow a remnant. He is always somehow a survivor, an inner something whose exterior was seized by the current of the world and carried off, while he himself, what is left of him, remains standing on the shore. Something within him is waiting. That is, if I can just paraphrase it, I know it's hard to take in, that he thinks of the human being, the evolved human being, as in some way yielding up the least important parts of him to real life, to the traffic of real life, the current of real life. But there's always a something, somehow, waiting like a remnant, a survivor, someone who doesn't quite know what's going to become of him. But he's waiting and watching. Yeah? Something within him is waiting for the moment to become real. And he sees this as a kind of an aspect of the human condition. That is something that human beings know about. Or if I were to quote another of my favorite thinkers and quotations, Maurice Blanchot, the French philosopher, he talks about how man keeps watch over absent meaning. He keeps watch. He's watching out. He's looking after. He's protecting meaning that is not yet there, that's not really there. It's absent. It's not there, and that doesn't make him go to sleep. On the contrary, it makes him more awake. So it's that kind of wakefulness that has to do with lishmor. And the echoes are echoes both of Leil Shimurim, the night of the Exodus, and also, of course, when else do we sit for 7 days? That's in the Sukkot, in the festival of Sukkot, where we sit in our Sukkot, which again doesn't really mean sit, it means abide, live there, be there, endure time that is not fully revealed yet. That's a temporary time, a temporary dwelling, the sense of temporariness, something fragile in a way that has to be sustained. Now I want to get back down to earth and to connect this with the issue of the golden calf and the issue of the Exodus from Egypt. That is, the urge to go out, to leave. You could say that was the very good impulse of leaving Egypt. Right? There was that. Leaving Egypt was the best thing that had happened to this people for a long time. Yetziat Mitzrayim. They had been in a narrow place. They'd been squeezed, right? Mitzrayim, Mitzarim, Mitzar, the classic midrashic pun. I was in the straits. Yeah? Min ha-Mitzar karatiya, the psalmist cries out. Yeah? From the straits I called to you, I go, oh God. And the midrashic tendency is to identify Egypt with a place of constraint, where you couldn't be yourself, you couldn't be free. You were living some other non-identity, some otherness. And getting out of there is not easy. But the idea was to get out of there, of course, to get out of there and find your freedom. What that consists of turns out to be a little paradoxical. In the meantime, I'd just like to say that even though, of course, Pesach is all about Yetziat Mitzrayim, getting out of there as fast as you can, it turns out that on that night of watching, they're not allowed to get out of there. There's a specific commandment, Lo tetzu. You shall not go out of the entrance of your houses during that night. So there's a kind of sense of living with Mitzrayim, living in it with the expectation of leaving it, but not yielding to that expectation, because that sounds a little bit too much like running away. That if you leave too enthusiastically, then it has a kind of panic dimension, you're not really leaving. And I'd like to say that that is what the egel is. That is what happened with the golden calf. According to Rashi, according to the midrash, there is a sense with the golden calf that the people have really never left Egypt. That however careful they were about staying during that night, a lot of them still, large parts of them, of their being, still remains in Egypt. Eric Zantner calls this Egyptomania. Egyptomania is a certain madness, it's a certain fantasy of Egypt, of the narrow places, that is, finding it really difficult to leave, that rigidity. The rigidity, which I want to say has to do with idolatry. It has to do with a certain way of doing things that makes you feel very safe. The repetition compulsions of Egypt, where you just do everything with a sense of this is what's going to give me security and it keeps my anxiety under control. I have absolute confidence in some way when I have an idol to look at. I project onto that idol all my own power. I give it all my power, and it now leads me and is responsible for me. There is something about that the people find it very difficult to let go of. What happens with the golden calf? I didn't give you sources for this because I haven't really tried. This is really by way of preamble in a way. Let me just very quickly point out Rashi on the word boshesh. How did the golden calf issue begin? Vayar ha'am ki boshesh Moshe. The people saw that Moshe was late, delayed in coming down the mountain. From the people's point of view, it was an unconscionable delay. It was an unbearable delay. And they couldn't bear delay. All right, how late was he? So Rashi asks, how late was he? What are we talking about here? We say he was up there for 40 days. Is that late? And this is the midrash that Rashi quotes. It's not on your page. Moshe told the people before he went up the mountain that he would be there for 40 days. And he'd be back in the middle of the day of the 40th day. He meant the day that begins with the evening, with the night. Right? That is the Jewish day. They misunderstood and they thought it was including the day they were already in. So they were a little ahead of him. He wasn't yet back on the 40th day by their reckoning. He was going to be back the following day. All right, why is all this said? Because the word boshesh then becomes a pun. It's not just to be late in a vague sense, delayed, but it's ba-shesh. 6 o'clock has come, right? Like the White Rabbit in Alice, yeah? They look at their watches at midday, which is the 6th hour of the day, sha'ot zmaniot, in that way of counting hours. At 6 o'clock strikes midday, high noon, and Moshe is not here. And they have an instant panic. An instant panic. Satan showed them, I'm quoting Rashi from, Satan showed them Dmut choshech ve'arafel ve'irbuvia. He showed them an image of darkness, deep darkness, fog, and confusion, chaos. Suddenly there's an image of total chaos, a sense that the world has no coherence to it at all. They are totally at a loss, they're at a wash in the world, and they say we must have someone to replace Moshe right away. A relatively modern commentary, the Meshech Chochmah, takes this an extraordinary stage further and says the people at that moment saw Moshe as if he were God. That is, before Moshe disappeared up the mountain, they had related to him as if he were, in fact, a kind of idol who was leading them out of Egypt. What do they say when they want to make the golden calf? They say, Ki zeh Moshe ha'ish asher ha'elanu mi'eretz Mitzrayim. Because this Moshe, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what's happened to him. And the Meshech Chochmah hears in that on the fantasy level, they really see him as the source of their redemption. They haven't really freed themselves of that whole constraining image of the world, which has to do with a relationship with a God who is not so much invisible. I don't think that's what the freedom comes from, but who does not belong to that world of constraints in some very important way. They can't live that difficult reality, and they immediately again focus on a figure, and that's the figure of Moshe, and as soon as that fetish figure fails them, they immediately regress to the original figures of Egypt, the calves and the oxen, and that were the idols of Egypt. So there is here a kind of seamless fallback into Egypt, as if they've never left Egypt at all, despite Matan Torah, despite Har Sinai, the giving of the Torah. And here we can now join our sources on your page. Number one. on your page. God says to Moshe at the top of the mountain, Saru Maher. They have turned aside very fast. Your people have turned us. Your people who you brought up from the land of Egypt, notice. In other words, God is rather ironically telling Moshe, according to this reading, your people, you know how they look at you? They think you brought them up. They have really gone bad. Sari Maher, they have really gone off very quickly. It hasn't taken them long at all. How long? Maybe 1 minute's delay. It doesn't have to be 40 days. It's one moment of catastrophe, of cataclysm, of pagan cataclysm. Amar Rabbi Shimon bar Chalafta. Very ironic passage. Let's read it in English. Perhaps that's easier. Yes. How many days were they with God? They say, well, it must have been with God at least 40 days. Not even one day. Even as the people stood at Sinai and declared with their mouths, we shall do and we shall listen. The great declaration that we are so proud of commitment to God, Na'aseh v'nishma. Their hearts were attuned to idolatry. Libam mechuvanim, where is it here? Yeah, libam haya mechuvan la'avodat kochavim. Their hearts were tuned to idolatry. Right? They said the right words, but it was lip service. Really, internally, there was deep ambivalence, at the very least. As it says, and then there's a quotation with a kind of devastating quotation from Psalms, they seduced God with their mouths, but their hearts were not attuned to him. There was a division between what they said and where they really were. They were still essentially in Egypt. They hadn't made that movement to a new identity, to a new life, in fact, at all. What you have in the early part of the midrash, including parts that I don't quote here, is a lot of irony about how long were they actually with God in that 40-day period. I'll just give you the gist of it. First view is they were only 11 of the 40 days with God. Im HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that's the expression, to be with God. Very interesting, I think. They kept company with God. They kept associated with God. And all the other 29 days already, even of those 40 days, they were already mitzchashvim ech la'asot et ha'egel. They were already working it out in their minds, in their deep minds, how to get back to the golden calf, to get back to the calves, to get back to the idol. And then the midrash proceeds through various combinations of numbers. No, says someone else, 29 days they were with God. No, says someone else, 2 days they were with God. And there are all kinds of proof texts to prove these positions. And someone else says, no, 1 day they were with God, that's all. And then the terrible conclusion is, no, not even 1 day. It didn't work at all. The whole transformation of the people was the demand was too radical, right? It's what Levinas calls difficile liberté. Yeah, the difficult idea of freedom. There's a certain kind of freedom that is offered them at Sinai that was just too difficult for them to take on, and they shrug it off immediately. In this sense, the miluim, the days of filling the priests, that is, of placing them, the miluim really comes from the idea of setting a jewel in its setting. A precious jewel, you put it in its setting, and now it can appear in full light. Now, this is going to be its function, it's in full dignity, and that idea of getting the right clothes, getting the right setting for yourself, that is something that takes a long time, and it takes time in which one isn't necessarily frantically putting on the clothes all the time. One is actually just living through a certain experience of that gap between the past and the future in an attempt to heal that gap. So that the making of the Mishkan is understood as being some kind of deep treatment, deep therapy for the problem of avodah zarah, idolatry, Egypt, the desire to return to Egypt, which we keep on hearing about, and at its most focused, the golden calf. Right? The people really gather all that desire together, and they want to make the golden calf. Like the bride under the wedding canopy. I don't know if you remember from last week, I think we talked about it, who even while she's standing there in the process, she's in her bridal costume. She can't be in her bridal costume. She's saying the words, but she can't be behind the words. And at that very moment, there is something in her that's hankering for her lovers, for someone else. So there's that sense of simultaneity. At the very same time, that is what a human being is like. Right? The crooked timber of humanity, as Kant called it. That we are not at all as simple as we look. There are many, many layers of what is going on deep beneath the clothing. God said, "V'asuli mikdash," make me a place that I can live in. V'shachanti b'tocham. And that's what the Mishkan is supposed to be. What does it do for the people in their progress towards becoming a different kind of people? That's really the question. Have a look at an extraordinary passage from the Gaon, from a passage in Shir HaShirim, in which he brings up a midrash that is not all that well known, it seems to be. I think it's a very foundational midrash, actually. It's a midrash that is enormously eloquent. When they made the golden calf, look at it in number 2. When they made the golden calf, nistalku ha'ananim, the clouds that had accompanied them in some ways, called the clouds. It's not maybe more than the pillar of cloud that guided them by day. There were things called ananei hakavod, the clouds of glory. And they left them. They abandoned them. Presumably they had these clouds from the time they left Egypt. And then they didn't return until they began to create the Mishkan. The minute they began the work on the Mishkan, the actual work of the Mishkan, those clouds returned. And then you get a kind of calendar of events here, just to show how well rooted this is in the text. Moshe came down the mountain on Yom Kippur, and the next day after that, Moshe gathered the people and commanded them with all the instructions of the Mishkan. That was on the 11th of Tishrei. Yes, and the people brought all the materials, baboker, in the morning. That means 2 more mornings, another 2 days. So we've got to the 13th of Tishrei. And then on the 14th of Tishrei, they've got all the materials. Natlu, all the artisans and artists took the materials from Moshe. And on the 15th day, they began the actual constructing of the Mishkan. V'az chazru ha'ananei kavod. And that's when these clouds of glory returned, made a reappearance. And that's why we make Sukkot on the 15th of Tishrei. Now look at the links that are being set up here. We know that, there is a festival on the 15th of Tishrei. But the midrash wants to say, we don't know that is what we really mean by Sukkot. What we really mean by Sukkot was that is the festival that celebrates the return of those mysterious, encompassing clouds that in a way that totally enveloped the people. That's how the tradition goes. They had it at some point in the past. You notice he doesn't describe really how they had it. They lost it when they made the golden calf. So there's a connection between the golden calf and losing it. They were abandoned. And then they came back. At what moment? 15th of Tishrei, which we will call Sukkot. And the Sukkot, the booths, will in some way remind us of being encompassed by the clouds of glory that from then on accompanied the people and signified a kind of reparation, a kind of therapy, a kind of cure, healing for the problem of the golden calf. Very intriguing, mysterious midrash that the Gaon wants us to be familiar with. Let me say 1 or 2 things about the clouds of glory. The clouds of glory are attributed with all kinds of protective powers. First of all, they surround the people on all 7 sides. I haven't worked that. 1, 2, 3, 6. Like we shake the lulav, yeah, in all seven directions. In some sense, all around and into the center. They serve the function of protecting the people against the heat of the sun, against the rough ground, against hills and valleys. Everything became smooth in front of them as they walked. They were so protected by these velvety clouds. They protected them from snakes. They maybe even gave them wings so that they could kind of float over the surface of the midbar. Perhaps most interestingly, they did their laundry for them. I like that detail. So that really, in a way, they were protected from all the nuisance contingencies of traveling through a desert. Now, is this real? They really didn't suffer at all? But what are we talking about here? Is this a fantasy of some kind? What it reminds me of, I have to say, and I'd like to bring this association to the surface, is the idea that Donald Winnicott, the British psychoanalyst, brought up, that the greatest need of the baby, of the newborn baby, and for quite a while after that, is being held by the mother. By which he doesn't mean only the mother actually embracing. He does mean an embrace, but it's like a spiritual embrace. That means he needs the sense of a certain unknown support. And that's the very mysterious language, almost mystical language, that this psychoanalyst uses. He says there is something about this child that is on the one hand totally dependent, but the child is not aware of being totally dependent, and it's only possible to bear that state of total dependence if there is somewhere some kind of sense the child taps into, a sense of what another psychoanalyst, Michael Eigen, calls it a sense of holiness, a sense of being alone in the maximum conditions of dependence, but with an infinite unknown support. Now the child is being supported, but is not aware it's being supported. Supported by what? Not just by the actual physical hugs of the mother, but by the envelope that the mother emotionally creates around the child. She's always thinking of the child. Now, it's a very spiritual idea, even the idea of using the word holiness here. There's a sanctity about this moment in life. And these are not people who are officially believers, Eigen and Winnicott. That state of things has an unawareness about it. It's only when you lose it, right, gradually in one way or another, the child separates from the mother. The child comes to more awareness, more consciousness of his separate self. Then he becomes aware that he's lost something. He may mourn it, or he may still be very unconscious of what he has lost. What is the difference between then and now? And there is no restoration in child development of that original sense of being held, unless it is, Winnicott wants to say, psychoanalysis. He says, that's how the psychoanalytic treatment is supposed to function. That's how it works. There is some kind of unknown support. You know, the analyst may not be behaving in a very nurturing way, obviously, may not be being very gentle, and at the same time, the constancy of their connection and the depth of their connection of patient and analyst creates a kind of, almost like a cocoon of some kind around the child patient. If that protection, that unknown support, were to be roughly withdrawn in infancy, that would mean a cataclysm for the child. It would be a real catastrophe. And I'm suggesting then that the golden calf, the making of the golden calf, was not just punished by the clouds disappearing. It was the fact that they made the golden calf was an act of anxiety in a world in which suddenly the clouds didn't work. Suddenly the clouds didn't work, and at the very same moment, they lost a previously unknown sense of support that they had had in their very early lives out of Egypt, after birth. And so there is a sense of a loss and an unawareness of a loss. And then the loss is restored. Right? It chazar, things return. How do things return? We talk about, the return of the repressed. It's as if something original has been forgotten, has been repressed. You can't bear to live with it. You can't bear to be in that place anymore. And then, strangely, your tolerance and your wish for such a place can return, and you then face the return of what has been kept down from the past. And that creates a kind of pattern for what happens from this point onwards. The people start working on the Mishkan. That in itself means that the clouds are returning. That is, that there is a sense that they're drawing on something. As they begin their creative lives to create things that will create an environment for God, right? It's a kind of reversal. They are creating an environment for God, and in doing so, they are creating an extra skin for themselves, some kind of protection, encompassment for themselves. Their lives tap into a new inner feeling of holiness because of the work. The work itself does that, and it opens a space then. The work opens a space for a sacred moment. Let's have a look now at the Rambam. This is quite a leap. The Rambam in number 3. These are the laws of Lulav. And we go now to Sukkot, which was the time when the people were indeed encompassed. The word encompassed is very important here. I don't think I stressed it enough in number 2. Yes. As chazru ananeha, what is it? One moment. Yes, it actually doesn't use that word in this passage. But in talking about the clouds of glory, many midrashic sources use the word lahakif. Lahakif is that those clouds of glory surrounded them, encompassed them entirely, like hakafot on Simchat Torah. Right? They were held within an electric ring, of some kind of unknownness that held them and gave them some kind of unknown support. That was the experience of the clouds. And now we come to Sukkot, and the Rambam here will talk about the peculiarity of Sukkot as being the intense form of joy that was to be the experience of Sukkot. Look at the first line there. Af al pi shekol hamoadot mitzvah lismoach behen, even though, on the one hand, all the festivals, it's a mitzvah to rejoice on them. All right, you can take that for granted. That's what a festival is. But Chag HaSukkot, suddenly it's singled out. In the mikdash was a day of exceeding joy, simcha yetera. Yetera means almost excessive. I think we have to bear that meaning in mind. It's a difficult word to use. That suddenly, from that time onwards, during Sukkot and every year since then, as long as we were in the mikdash, it was a time of abounding joy, almost unruly joy, unconstrained joy. 7 days of joy. There is that 7 days again. How did they make that joyfulness? Ketzad. There has to be now a kind of concrete description, a phenomenological description. What was Sukkot for them? What was this joy? The evening before Sukkot, the evening before Yom Tov, they would set up separate seating places for men and women. That's very interesting as a first step in describing the joy. Right? It describes the overwhelming nature of the joy by describing the boundaries. Because it was going to be so overwhelming, it makes sense, doesn't it? They had to separate men and women before Sukkot ever started, because you never knew what would happen. In fact, it was quite understandable what would happen if they hadn't separated men and women. So you get a sense already of something almost, it's too strong a word yet, but let me use it while it's in my mind, almost of a grotesque joy. A joy that really goes beyond any kind of understanding. Something that wells up from places in oneself that one has no knowledge of. And so you had to prevent the mixing of the sexes. That's the first stage. The next paragraph, paragraph 13. And what was it like, this joy? What were its elements? What did it look like? What did it sound like? Right? And here you have a kind of cascade of descriptions. The flute was struck and the violin, harps and cymbals were played, and everyone played any instrument he knew how to play. Right? If you listen to it in Hebrew, yes. החליל מכה ומנגנין בכינור ובנבלים ובמצלתיים וכל אחד ואחד בכלי שיר שהוא יודע לנגן בו ומי שיודע בפה ורוקדין ומספקין ומצפחין ומפזזין ומקרקרין כל אחד ואחד כמו שיודע. אומרים דברי שירות ותשבחות. It's a cascade, it's an avalanche of different instruments, different kinds of playing, different kinds of dancing, clapping one's thighs, you name it. Anything that in your repertoire, anything that you know how to do, if you're skilled at an instrument, and if you can sing, you can use your mouth, that's perfect. Also, so you can use anything and everything. Have you ever seen one of these amazing, I can't remember the name of this Scotsman who was recently very much in public eye, who can make an instrument of anything. And he sings and creates all kinds of what sounds like instruments just by clapping, by using his throat, unbelievable. And so the idea here is something like use your bodies and what your bodies can do to create this simcha yetera. But of course you have to be careful about Shabbat, because there again, there is the limit. Watch out that doesn't overrule Shabbat. So there's that sense of, before I go any further, I have to take a step back. So there is Shabbat. The next passage. It's a mitzvah to do a lot of this rejoicing. Laharbot, right? To intensify this rejoicing. And who did it? Who specialized in it? Not the ordinary people. Not anyone who felt like it. You would have thought it's a carnival, such as they have in every nation. Where the people go mad, the people go crazy. No, it turns out to be a very specialized carnival. Gdolei Chachmei Yisrael. Only the greatest sages, the heads of the yeshivot, the heads of the courts, the most pious people, the elders, the people who are known for their good deeds. In other words, the spiritual and intellectual elite. They were the ones who specialized in this kind of joy. They were dancing and misapkin, clapping and playing and rejoicing there. But the whole people, the rest of the people, the men and the women, just came to watch and to listen. What an uncanny description. The simcha yetera, this excessiveness, was something that was entrusted only to the most dignified people. And the paradox of that is then played out in the last passage, in which Rambam is no longer describing what to do, but he is presenting a theology, really. He's developing a theology from this. Paragraph 15. Hasimcha sheyismach adam ba'asiyat hamitzvah ba'ahavat hakel. The joy that a person rejoices when he does the mitzvah of loving God, as God had commanded. Avodah gedolahi. It's a great service of God. It's great work. It's important work. The work of joy. It's the response to a deep mitzvah. And anyone who restrains himself from this kind of joy, notice, who holds himself back out of a kind of fastidiousness or sense of dignity, that is a highly misplaced sense of dignity. He will be punished. He ought to be punished, and there's a verse to support that, because you didn't worship your God in joy and goodness of heart, in a wholehearted way. That is a problem. That's a spiritual problem. Not to be capable of letting down your hair, as it were. And it's only the most fastidious and the most dignified of the people who know how to do this. That's the paradox. And anyone who coarsens his mind, that is, who really gets it wrong, who makes a Philistine of himself, and he gives honor to himself, and he regards himself as dignified in his own eyes, in such places, that expression is very important for me, in places like the Mishkan, or the places like the Beit HaMikdash on Sukkot, if in such places a person acts dignified and haughty, he is a choteh and a shoteh. This is Rambam being his most scathing. Not only a sinner, but even worse, a fool. A fool. There's no worse condemnation for the Rambam. And that's why Shlomo HaMelech said, don't give yourself dignity when you are in the presence of the king. That is, you're in the presence of the king, you don't think about yourself, you think about the king. You are swept up somewhere in that, you're in a way surrounded by that presence. Anyone who lowers himself, mashpil atzmo, who lets his ego go, who just surrenders somewhere to a kind of lightness of being, a kind of indignity in these places, when you are in these places, in these times, hu hagadol hamechubad. He is the most distinguished and the most dignified, who serves God in love. The important thing that's said here is it's not just leave dignity behind you and opt for a kind of undignified, clownish cavorting around, because that's what God wants. It goes further than that. It's saying it's not binary. In leaving dignity behind, formal dignity, kind of institutional dignity, your formal robes and so on, in doing that, you are the most dignified possible. That is the true dignity if it's done through love of God. And I want to come back to this paradox later. And we learn it from David HaMelech. I'm sure you're thinking of that example. If I could see the chat, I would probably see you writing and telling me now. David HaMelech came in dancing so wildly. He led the camp when he was bringing the Aron, the Ark of God, back into Yerushalayim, from where it had been in exile, right? Things coming home, things being restored. He was doing that. He was dancing like a wild man. He exposed his body. And that, who I was mekarker umefazez, that's the expression that's used there. Mefazez umefarker. He was, the language, Hebrew language is stretched to find words for it. These are grotesque words. He was cavorting and my English abandons me. You know, he was wheeling and curling and twining around in circles. He was completely out of control, lifnei Hashem, in the presence of God. And if you remember, his wife Michal watches him doing it and sneers at him. You put on a fine spectacle, didn't you? She has a proper sense of dignity, of this false dignity. And she says to him, you've been exposed in front of the eyes of the lowest of the people. You know, that's very dignified. You are like one of the empty people. Achad harikim. You have been acting your emptiness. And she never had a child after that. The book of Samuel then says. And I'd suggest that it's not really a punishment for her haughtiness, for her misplaced ego. It's a function of the same thing. That is, she is restrained. She is inhibited. She doesn't recognize the moment for going deeper into the experience of joy, of discovering the excess in joy and allowing oneself to enact it. And that's something that only the elite of the people really know how to do well, and the others watch, maybe trying to learn something from this. So that is the Rambam. Have a look now, when we start moving through the sources. Have a look at Shemot Rabbah in number 5. Actually, number 4. I missed number 4. Midrash Gadol, yes. We hear at the end of Sefer Shemot that there was a cloud of God over the Mishkan by day and a fire by night. When Israel saw the pillar of fire, the pillar of cloud, shochen ala Mishkan, resting over the Mishkan, they rejoiced. And they said, now God has been reconciled with us. He has been reconciled with us. That is, God has forgiven us. What the people are internally concerned with is some kind of inner knowledge, deep knowledge, that the golden calf has in some way been worked out of their system. That something has happened to change their inner world. And they will only know it through having a deep inner experience of something in the real world. And when they see that cloud, they see it as some kind of testimony to a real change in themselves, and that God really is now nitratzeh. Nitratzeh has ideas of love in it, that he's back to loving us. But then at night, what happened? The pillar of fire came down. Now, look what the midrash is doing here with the facts, as we had them at the end of the book of Exodus. That was fire by night and cloud by day. The pillar of fire came down, and it surrounded the Mishkan. It completely surrounded the Mishkan, and the people saw it as one flame of consuming fire, and they began to wail and cry, and they said, Oy lanu, woe to us, l'rek yaganu, we have been laboring for nothing, that emptiness, rek. It's all been a waste. We've been trying so hard to build a Mishkan that represents a real inner movement on our part, that we have entered somewhere into that unknown, uneasy place inside us that we never dared to address. And kol masha asinu v'higdalnu, all that we have done so greatly in creating this Mishkan, nisraf l'sha'ah. It's all been burnt up in a moment. So they see the pillar of fire as a sign of absolute cataclysm. God has rejected our work, basically. And they feel an enormous sense of bewailing, of mourning and crying as if for a great loss. It's a loss deep in themselves. It's a loss of something in themselves that has to do with the way that the pillar of cloud has transformed into fire. But then they get up in the next morning, and suddenly the story has 3 parts, not just 2. They rejoiced originally over the pillar of cloud, then they cried and wailed, and then the next morning they get up early, and they see Amud Ha'anan mekif oto. The pillar of cloud is encompassing. There's that word lahakif again. Totally enveloping the Mishkan. And when they see that, miyad samchu simcha yitera. They immediately began to rejoice, an exceeding, excessive joy. That is some place of excess inside them, some kind of unnameable place which they find it very difficult to go near, is at this moment revealed to them. It's touched into life. The depth of their joy at finding that after all, something is here encompassing us. And that means something about our inner worlds. And they said, this is testimony to everyone out there in the world. Yeah, for some reason they're interested in how other people look at this too. They want to make a statement to the world that if they wanted to make such a thing, they can't. In other words, we have an exclusive experience here that no one else could possibly have, which is a kind of, I think, quite a fair description of how one feels when one has an exceeding and an excessive experience. When one has an experience of extreme intensity, there is a feeling that, there's no one out there who can really understand what this is. That other people must be completely mystified, really, by it. But when they see this mysterious phenomenon, they'll know that it's unnameable. And all that, why? How does all this come to be? Because of the exceeding love of God for Israel. And so they imagine a kind of exceeding love coming towards them, and they have in themselves a kind of, what it touches off in them is access to a place that they've never tapped before. And it's not a rational place. I won't read the last sentence because I haven't got time for that, although it's quite wonderful too. Let's move on now to number 5. We're going to look at another few examples of this exceeding love and what it comes from. Davar acher, Shmot Rabbah, number 5. This is testimony. Right? What is testimony? The Edut, Mishkan HaEdut. The tabernacle is a tabernacle of testimony to the whole world that it has been appointed by God. Right? In other words, what we have here is the people celebrating the fact that, actually it says here that Moshe was appointed by God to erect the tabernacle. Right? It's testimony to the whole world that something extraordinary and transcendent is happening here among us. What is this like? It's like a king who married a wife and he loved her yoter midai, which it seems, to be fair, simply means a great deal. He loved her a lot. But I can't help noticing yoter midai. What's the difference between loving a lot and loving too much? It's as if whenever you love a lot, somewhere you're tapping that place of too much. Something that is extraterritorial. You know, it's there hidden at the heart of you and you don't usually know about it. But then what happened after all that love? He became angry with her and abandoned her. It doesn't have anything about golden calves or adultery, just sudden, as if it's arbitrary. And then the neighbors said, he's never coming back to you. So the neighbors have a very skeptical view of the situation. Oh, he's gone and he's never coming back. After a while, he sends a message and he says, prepare the palace, prepare everything, I'm coming to you. And when the day came, he came to her and he made peace with her and he went in to the palace to be with her and to eat and drink with her, which is a sort of way of saying the kind of euphemism for he had relations with her. But the kind neighbors couldn't believe it. Lo hayu ma'aminot. I love that expression. All right? They remain skeptical. Impossible, can't be. But when they smelled the fragrance of the spices that came from the palace, then they did believe. Yes. At that moment, yad'u, they really knew something, that there had been a reconciliation here. So what tells them there was a reconciliation? Why should perfume tell them anything? What are they smelling here? And I want to suggest that it's what they're smelling it's untoward. It's the spices like the spices of the incense offerings in the Mishkan, which are the most spiritual and the most unnameable and the most unconcrete, non-concrete of the sacrifices. They represent the heart of the matter. And when they suddenly sense these fragrances wafting in the air, they know that something has happened inside the palace that is indescribable, literally. You can call it, that the king has returned home to his wife. But the way it manifests itself is as mystery. It's the mystery of reunion, the mystery of something the nations can't really put a name to. In the same way, God loved Israel, and he brought them to Har Sinai, and he gave them the Torah, and he called them a kingdom of priests. So he gave them all kinds of wonderful gifts. It was a very loving relationship. And then after 40 days of giving the Torah, they sinned, and at that moment, the other nations, the idol worshippers, said, he's never going to be reconciled with the people. All right? There will be no more. The people are completely displaced now. They're out of place. They're out of any kind of world order. They're lost now. And there's a kind of deep skepticism in the world about the possibility of undoing that loss. Once there has been an abandonment, once the idols have taken over again, then there's no possibility of chazara, of return. How should something mysterious return? How is it possible to have a return of the repressed? But when then Moshe came and asked for mercy for the people, and immediately God forgave them. So it comes to sound very simple. As it said, God said, I have forgiven them as you have spoken. He says to Moshe, you said I should forgive them, and I did, no problem. So that part's easy. But Moshe is still not satisfied. He says, Ribbon ha'olam, master of the world, hareini mefuyas, appeased because you have forgiven Israel. That's good. Ela hodia le'enei kol ha'umot she'ein belibcha alehem. But I need you, one more thing. I need you to make it known to all the nations of the world that you have no resentment lurking in your heart about them. In other words, that this is a full-hearted retrieval for the people of some kind of unknown glory that they had before. Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu chayecha. If you remember that from last week, where God is having a really intimate conversation with Moshe, he says chayecha, as one says to a good friend, meaning as you live, which means you don't begin to understand. Let me tell you something. Chayecha. You want testimony? Hareini mashresh chinati betochem. I'm going to bring my presence to dwell among them, in their midst. And of course, as many people have noticed, culminating in Hasidic traditions, it doesn't say, I'll bring my presence to dwell in it, in the Mishkan, but in them. There will be a return in them. And that is enough for the nations. Shne'emar v'asuli mikdash. They are going to make for me a holy place, which is not only out there, but in some, right? We'll leave that aside for the time being. Makirin shemachalti lahem. They will acknowledge, they will realize that I have forgiven them. Now the question is, who will realize? It sounds as if, to make sense, it has to be the nations of the world will understand that I really have forgiven the Israelites, because that's what Moshe wanted. I don't know if there are variant readings in the midrash. Lakach ne'emar mishkan ha'edut. It's a tabernacle of testimony. She'edut hi liYisrael, because it is a testimony to Israel that God had forgiven them. So what do we have here? It seems that it's a little confused somehow, isn't it? What's the function of the perfume? What's the function of the other nations? Those who believe in idols, and as believing in idols, they're constrained by the nature of it from understanding the ways of God, the mysterious possibilities of perfume. And for Moshe, it's important that they should have some inkling of this, because it's through their inkling that Bnei Yisrael also will begin to feel the full resonance of what's happening inside them. When they are aware that those outside, the nations of the world, are experiencing a sense that something transcendent and intimate has happened, then Bnei Yisrael themselves will experience the full resonance of that unimaginable intimacy. That is, they experience it, the intimacy, God comes to dwell among them, but its full impact is made by the sense that the nations of the world are also impacted by the mystery of this event. Right? They don't understand how it can happen, but in some way it can happen. What the people have done is left a little mysterious, right? They did that act, as it's sometimes called. Asu ha'ma'aseh hazeh. They did that thing that we can't even talk about. It comes from a place of total anxiety and fear that the people can't address in themselves. And the interesting thing is, from now on, for the time that we have left, what we will see in the midrashic traditions is, unexpectedly, that although God says he's going to bring his presence among them, and although God prepares everything and tells Moshe to prepare everything with the priests, that they should be ready to make it happen 7 days, all 7 days, in spite of all that, the people have repeated experiences of all their efforts being in vain. Experiences of intense shame, of intense disappointment, because lo sharta shkina. People are expecting that thing to happen that we're calling God dwelling among them, Right? That experience which will be the real sense of reconciliation with God in their midst, or perhaps even more powerfully, their being with God, rather than God in their midst. We're not up to that yet. But that they really are, again, associating with God, has become possible for them. And it doesn't happen. And that's the rather tragic dimension that I want to just brush against now by looking at a few sources here. For instance, it's number 7. Let's have a quick look at number 6 before that. Famous passage from Pirkei Avot. Hu haya omer, Hillel used to say, Chaviv Adam she... One moment. Yes. Chaviv Adam she nivra b'tzelem. Precious, beloved is the human being who is created in the image of God. Chiba yetera, there is that word yetera. Exceeding love is in the phenomenon of being made to know that one was created in the image of God. That is, to be created in the image of God, that's an act of love by God. But it only becomes exceeding love. It only becomes exceeding love, sometimes almost unmanageable love, when God actually tells the first human being that he tells that he's created in the image of God. And who is that? It's not Adam. It's Noah, after the flood. God actually tells him in chapter 9. He actually tells him because man was created in the image of God. It's as if Adam might have in some way intuited it, but God never told him. We know. It's important to have that kind of sense of being made to know something. Nodalo. And then something deep is tapped in oneself. One becomes aware deeply in oneself of something that is in a way external, that someone is telling one of something that happened to one, and then one's whole sense of oneself is in some way transformed. The example that comes to my mind is of being told. Yeah? My mother used to make a point of telling me as a child that I was very like my grandfather. And we had photographs of my grandfather up, and he was a great Talmid Chacham. And I would look at those photographs and I would think, what? I'm not in the least like him. I took it very naively. But the idea was planted in my mind. And it found a place in which to grow. That is, it struck my imagination, if you want to put it like that. And I began to imagine what it would be like, in a much looser sense, to be like this grandfather. And so it had a kind of creative impact. And that is, the creative impact, what it does is create an intensity of some kind, an inner intensity of experience, from which one can create an identity, somewhat. Have a look at number 7, right? The despairing parts of all this. At a certain point in the proceedings, right, in next week's Parsha, actually, the people are still somewhat despairing. Moshe and Aaron come out and bless the people at a certain point. That's the 8th day, when it's all supposed to happen, no question about it. It's also that by that time, it's high time. They come out and bless the people. And Rashi asks, so what was the blessing that they give them? And the blessing is, Yehi ratzon shetishra shechina b'maaseh yedechem. May it be God's will that the Shekhinah really does come to rest in the work of your hands. Why? Because all those 7 days of miluim with which we started, of investiture, of becoming different, during those 7 days Moshe was constructing the Mishkan and serving in it and taking it apart every day. So it was going through a lot of turbulence. It was coming together and taken apart, and Moshe was playing a role. All that time, lo sharta bo Shekhinah. The Shekhinah did not come to rest. Now, we assume that's the case. It wasn't yet ready. The people were still preparing. The Kohanim were still preparing. But the midrash picks up on the poignancy of the negative. All that time, the Mishkan remained empty. Really, that's what it comes down to. empty of the imagined, expected, anticipated Hashrat HaShechina, the inspiration that was going to bring it all to life. And Israel were ashamed. The result was that the people suddenly became aware in themselves of a certain terrible shame, nichlamim. And they said to Moshe, all that hard work that we did, kol hatorach shetarachnu, shetishre Shechina, we did it all so that this fruition would happen, that the Shechina would be among us, v'neda, and we would know, that deep knowledge again, that we had been, the golden calf has been atoned for. Right? How can we ever know that unless the Shechina comes and there's a sense of animation and of inspiration? And it doesn't happen. Lo sharta Shechina. And so Moshe comes out and he blesses them that it really should happen, what everyone is longing for. Right? You finished that beautiful work of art that you put so much effort into, and it hasn't come alive. It's something, the essential is still missing. And he gives the essential blessing here, and indeed it does after that happen. I won't follow up the ending of Rashi because, again, I feel pressed by time. It has something to do with installing Aaron more firmly in their estimation, that it's only through him that it's going to happen. When he is Kohen Gadol, then you're going to see it really happening. And of course, Aaron himself is ashamed. This comes out in other passages in Rashi. When it doesn't happen, he is the one who is most immediately ashamed because he was instrumental in helping the people to build the golden calf. So there's a sense here of a kind of blanket of shame that covers the people, instead of that sense of coherence and meaning and excessive joy. Come back to Sukkot, number 8. A law of Sukkot here. A sukkah that is too high, it's above 20 cubits high, is unfit. Right? Pasul. It's rejected, it's not right. Where do we get this? Rabbah said, as the verse states, right, famous verse of course, Leman yed'u dorotechem ki basukot hoshavti et bnei Israel. That you build Sukkot in order that your generations shall know, your children's children shall know, there's that word, to know, with that depth, that in Sukkot, in these fragile, encompassing frameworks, I had them sit. If the Sukkah is up to 20 cubits, then a person knows with that deep spatial sense that he is living in a sukkah. That is, he sees the roof, he sees the sukkah, and he has that sense of being encompassed. He knows because of what he sees. He can see it, but the important thing is not that he sees it and then he realizes that symbolizes something. It's the body, the intimate body sense it gives him. I am being housed. I am housed in this rather temporary dwelling. Right? So there's a certain measure of anxiety, there's an intensity about the experience of knowing that one is in a sukkah. If it's higher than 20 cubits, a person is not aware that he is residing in a sukkah, de lo shalta ba'ena, because his eye cannot hold, he can't contain in his eye the roof, the ceiling. He can't actually register it in his mind's eye as being part of the dwelling that encompasses him. So the important thing here is to have an intimate sense of being held in a transcendence. Right? So being held in something that is not exactly oneself and that could be fragile. Right? Sukkot David hanofelet, that could fall down. And omitting many possible midrashic sources to this effect, I will go straight now to number 9. Moshe actually constructs the Mishkan, which means putting together all the boards, right? This is during the 7 days, putting together all the boards, which no one else can do. Lama lo amad miyad, the question is asked. Why didn't it stand up right away? Moshe's, right, the first time he stood it up, and look, it stands. Why didn't it stand up? But apparently it just collapsed, as if to say, no, it's not working. Right? Can't contain anything, can't contain the presence of God. But no, the deeper reason is, Shechashav HaKadosh Baruch Hu la'arev simchat HaMishkan b'simchat hayom shenolad bo Yitzchak. What a strange observation. Because God thought, his deep thoughts, Ma'od amku machshvotecha, the midrash quotes that verse later on, how deep are God's thoughts. You know, the idea of the depth. The depth means the inscrutability. It's not easy to get hold of, to understand at all the thoughts of God. And this deep paradoxical thought was that the simcha, the joy of the Mishkan, should be mixed up with the joy of the day when Yitzchak was born. And here we come to the last issue that I want to engage with. What was God's deep thought? Why, in fact, did the Mishkan not come together? Why was it impossible? Everyone tried, and Moshe, failures time and time again. Not to speak of the fact that Moshe was actually taking it apart every day. He was building it up and taking it apart, and building it up and taking it apart, perhaps twice, 3 times every day. So there's a real sense of unsatisfaction. We don't have our structure yet. We have nothing that can contain God. And the people are being really kind of, they enter into that inner place, that extra surplus place that one doesn't know what to do with, which has to do with anxiety and fear and even resentment and even rebellion. Look at the end of the midrash. The people are really upset because they suspect Moshe of dragging things out, that yes, just a moment, of dragging things out, that Moshe is delaying the constructing of the Mishkan, somehow as to give himself more importance meantime, and in all this atmosphere which is created by the failure. Who does thrive? A group that are called, it's a purely midrashic fiction, Leitzanei Hador, the mockers of the generation. It's people, those among the people who are specialize in mockery. Leitzan, right? We're coming to Purim. There's a lot about Purim in what I've already said and perhaps what we'll get to now. That is, these are people, clowns, cavorters, people who laugh at, who mock, who sneer. Many of the associations are negative. They are destroyers. They are those who see there's a gap between the promise and the fulfillment, and they want to make the gap as wide as possible. And that's what connects this moment of the Mishkan with the moment when Yitzchak was born, God's deep thoughts, because at that moment also there was a lot of leitzanut. Midrash on the birth of Yitzchak. Why is he called Yitzchak? Partly because there's so much laughter around his birth. And it's laughter of incredulity. Sarah laughs. Yes, you remember? But Yitzchak Sarah bekirba. She laughs most intimately because she has the inner body knowledge of the fact that she can't come back to life again, that her body has aged. There's no way. It's like saying she will be revived from the dead. And so she laughs a very real, deep laughter. And God insists, God actually, the expression that's used in the Midrash is, Harbe kama kirkurim, kirker hakadosh baruch hu. How many cavortings and somersaults did God somersault? It's the same word that's used of the rejoicers, the dancers in the Mishkan, that they were mekarkurim. They were turning cartwheels. And how many cartwheels did God turn? How many indirections did he go through? Giving the news of the birth to Avraham, that she will tell, that he will tell. Indirect ways, not coming to Sarah right away and telling her directly about the child. Why did he do that? Because in order, let me get the actual expression. Kama kirkurim, yes, all that, bishvil lishmoa sichatan shel tzidkaniot. Because he wanted to hear the inner conversation, sicha, of righteous women. That is, what is in that deep place where one There is no order. One doesn't know what to think. What happens there when you have a righteous woman who is assailed by the impossible, by something that is promised that is impossible? What goes on in there? And it's as if God doesn't necessarily want her to pretend to be better than she is. In fact, what he wants of her is to admit clearly, to say clearly, she did laugh. You remember that interchange at the end of the scene with the angel. The angel says, she says, didn't laugh. And the angel says, lo, ki tzachakt. It's as if what God is saying through this is, I want you to engage with that deep laughter of yours, which has two faces to it. On the one hand, there is the sneering side. There's a side that says it's impossible. Can't happen. I know. First person, I know. At the same time, there is an element of wonder. There's a sense of something is being offered here that is outside my possibility of understanding. And that has a kind of, it's a sense of also of instability, of not knowing where to put yourself, but a sense that maybe, of waiting for something. Avraham also laughs. And the midrash, you might think a little unfairly, distinguishes between the two laughters and says that Avraham laughed a laughter of faith and wonder. Isn't this amazing? It's going to happen. And she laughs a laughter of mockery, liglega. Well, even if it's so, I think there's a connection between the two laughters. They both come from a sense of basic wonder at the world, at the things that the world throws up. I wouldn't even emphasize the word miracles, unless in the sense, as you find with the women of Egypt, that they knew that God does miracles. That is part of their deep, intimate knowledge of childbirth, of the basic things of life, is that God does miracles. Not that he will do, but that it's part of the way life unfolds, part of the way things happen. It doesn't always happen. There is anxiety. The ability to face the anxiety and the unknown and to live in it in some very real way and to create out of it. I would take it as far as that. Leads the people, in the end, if we are to assume that they do go that path rather than fleeing and defending themselves with all kinds of calf objects which offer total reassurance. Then we get to the material of the last quote on your page. It's not the last quote, the last Hebrew quote on your page. I'm not going to get to the English quotes, but please do read them yourselves. Of course, there is the Wordsworth quote, misspelled, unfortunately, number 12, about the clouds of glory, and you can work out yourselves how those trailing clouds of glory are different from the ones we've been talking about. And there's Milan Kundera in the Book of Laughing and I can't believe it. Also, I don't know if it's my fault. The Book of Laughing and Forgetting. Okay. About the two kinds of laughter. I'm going to finish with this source from the Orach Chaim, number 10. A source that one couldn't have predicted. God says, "V'shachanti b'tochem," I will dwell in their midst. Let them make for me a mikdash, and I'll dwell in their midst. It doesn't say in its midst, as if to say that the place that they will sanctify for God to dwell in will be in the midst of Bnei Yisrael, in the midst of the children of Israel. Right in the center, the Mishkan will be in the center of the camp. That's one way of thinking of it. A different way of thinking of it is that it will be in the midst of them. In the midst of them. Sheyakifu ha-mishkan b'dalet galim. That the Mishkan will be surrounded by the four flags, north, south, east, and west, the four directions of the camp, 3 tribes on each side, forming a kind of mekif structure which will contain the place where God will live. That's the concrete version of it. And then the Orach Chaim goes wholeheartedly for the opposite, for the different version. That is the more mystical version. He says, ulai. I like that ulai. Right? It's waiting, it's watching. Perhaps, he says, these words of God were a response to Israel's desire. Those words are very weighted. It's not a commandment, they should build for me. Yeah? It's a response to a wish of the people that God knows. He knows that perhaps even unknown to them, they have a deep place in themselves which wants something. It's let's say a fantasy. There's a deep fantasy in them, and God says yes. What was the fantasy? Drawing on another more well-known midrash, at Har Sinai, what was the experience of Mount Sinai? They saw God mukaf, there's that word again, encompassed by the flags of the angels. And God was like a flag in the midst of them, ot. He was a banner of significance in among the angels. The angels are surrounding, holding, cherishing, protecting God, as it were. And God is in the middle, giving meaning to that circle, that dancing circle of the people, betochem. And when the people saw this image of the angels with God, the people were suddenly possessed of chashku ahav. They had a loving desire to have this in their midst. That is, somewhere they want, it's mimesis, they have a deep sense of a desire that God should be in them, that they should surround and encompass God in just that way. And to that came God's response, God who is the one who penetrates the heart, bochen libot. He can go in very deep there. And God said in response to this, va'asuli mikdash, if they do make for me a holy place, v'shachanti kmochen b'tocham, then I will live just as I did among the angels. In some sense, I will live in them. I think this is a new desire in the people. This represents a different stage of development. So far, we have been talking about the clouds of glory encompassing the people, right? The Sukkah encompassing, and the anxieties of that. The anxieties that come with a kind of promise of an unknown protection. But that, in a way, is a child desire, the desire to be held, to be protected. Perhaps a more mature desire, and I would have to say a feminine desire, is the desire to hold, not the desire to be held. Right? It's a maternal desire, the desire to have something in oneself that is not oneself, that is transcendent but is in oneself. It's in oneself and it grows as a place of intensity inside. It's an extraness in oneself, very much as Rosenzweig described it, a something, a somehow that remains inside. And it's also an erotic desire, yeah, to hold the beloved inside. So that is the mature desire of the people. And God appreciates that desire. And he says to them, right, if that's what you want, then I will act on that. And that therefore behind the apparent command, which comes across as almost like an arbitrary demand of God, what does God want of them? There is the sense that the command itself is a reflection of something in the people. He picks up on something very intimate within the people and he gives it voice. And he says, well, let's see what you can do with this. And there is, from this time onwards, there is a tradition that talks about God and his mother. Yes, somewhere the sense of, in Shir HaShirim, the king rejoices with the crown that his mother crowned him. So what are we talking about here? When did his mother crown him with a crown? And we have an extraordinary midrash there about how God loved Israel under various kinds of relationship. She starts off as his daughter, then she becomes his sister, and then finally she becomes his mother. And there is that sense of a growing equality and even a sense of a being with, actually. A being inside, not only outside, protecting, but an inner transcendence that the people will cultivate in themselves in what I'm calling a feminine manner. Thank you very much for your patience. I know we're 5 minutes overdue. I just wanted to add that I would be very glad if you have questions or comments, if you would send me send me your questions on the email that I think has been posted on the chat, so that I can have some sense of who I've been talking to. So please don't hesitate if you'd like to do that. Thank you very much.